Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, chapters 8 and 9, starting on page 118.
Greetings. Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondents, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Chapter 8, Teaching School in a Stable and a Henhouse. I confess that what I saw during my month of travel and investigation left me with a heavy heart. The work to be done in order to lift these people up seemed almost beyond accomplishing. I was only one person, and it seemed to me that the little effort which I could put forth could go such a short distance without bringing forth any results. I wondered if I could accomplish anything and if it were worthwhile for me to try. One thing I felt more strongly convinced than ever after spending this month in seeing the actual life of the colored people, and that was that in order to lift them up, something must be done more than merely to imitate New England education as it then existed. I saw more clearly than ever the wisdom of the system which General Armstrong had inaugurated at Hampton. To take the children of such people as I had been among for a month, and each day give them a few hours of mere book education, I felt would be almost a waste of time. After consultation with the citizens of Tuskegee, I set July 4th, 1881 as the day for the opening of the school in the little shanty and church which had been secured for its accommodation. The white people, as well as the colored, were greatly interested in the starting of the new school, and the opening day was looked forward to with much earnest discussion. There were not a few white people in the vicinity of Tuskegee who looked with some disfavor upon the project. They questioned its value to the colored people and had a fear that it might result in bringing about trouble between the races. Some had the feeling that in the proportion as the Negro received education, in that same proportion would his value decrease as an economic factor in the state. These people feared the result of education would be that Negroes would leave the farms and that it would be difficult to secure them for domestic service. The white people who questioned the wisdom of starting this new school had in their minds pictures of what was called an educated Negro with a high hat, imitation gold eyeglasses, a showy walking stick, kid gloves, fancy boots, and whatnot. In a word, a man who was determined to live by his wits. It was difficult for these people to see how education could produce any other kind of colored man. In the midst of all the difficulties which I had encountered in getting the little school started, and since went through a period of 19 years, there are two men among all the many friends of the school in Tuskegee upon whom I depended constantly for advice and guidance. And the success of the undertaking is largely due to these men, for whom I have never sought anything in vain. I mention them simply as types. One, a white man and an ex slaveholder named Mr. George W. Campbell. The other is a black man and an ex slave named Mr. Lewis Adams. These were the two men who wrote to General Armstrong for a teacher. Mr. Campbell is a merchant and banker and had little experience in dealing with matters pertaining to education. Mr. Adams was a mechanic and had learned the trades of shoemaking, harness making, and tinsmithing during the days of slavery. He had never been to school a day in his life, but in some way he had learned to read and write while a slave. From the first, these two men saw clearly that my plan of education was what my plan of education was, sympathized with me, and supported me in every effort. In the days which were darkest financially for the school, Mr. Campbell was never appealed to when he was not willing to extend all the aid in his power. I do not know two men, one an ex slave holder, one an ex slave, whose advice and judgment I would feel more like following in everything which concerns the life and development of the school at Tuskegee than that of those two men. I have always felt that Mr. Adams, in a large degree, derived his unusual power of mind from the training given his hands in the process of mastering well three trades during the days of slavery. If one goes today into any Southern town and asks for the leading and most reliable colored man in the community, I believe that in 5 cases out of 10, he will be directed to a Negro who learned a trade during the days of slavery. On the morning that the school opened, 30 students reported for admission. I was the only teacher. The students were about equally divided between the sexes. Most of them lived in Macon County, the county in which Tuskegee is situated and of which it is the county seat. A great many more students wanted to enter the school, but it had been decided to receive only those who were above 15 years of age and who had previously received some education. The greater part of the 30 were public school teachers, and some of them were near 40 years of age. With the teachers came some of their former pupils, and when they were examined, it was amusing to note that in several cases the pupil entered a higher class than did his former teacher. It was also interesting to note how many books some of them had studied and how many high sounding subjects some of them claimed to have mastered. The bigger the book and the longer the name of the subject, the prouder they felt of their accomplishment. Some had studied Latin and one or two Greek. This they thought entitled them to special distinction. In fact, one of the saddest things I saw during the month of travel, which I have described as a young man who had attended some high school, sitting down in a one-room cabin with grease on his clothing, filth all around him, and weeds in the yard and garden, engaging in the study of French grammar. The students who came first seemed to be fond of memorizing long and complicated rules in grammar and mathematics, but had little thought or knowledge of applying these rules to the everyday affairs of their life. One subject which they liked to talk about and tell me which they had mastered was arithmetic. In arithmetic was banking and discount. But I soon found that they nor almost anyone in the neighborhood in which they lived had ever had a bank account. In registering the names of students, I found that almost every one of them had one or more middle initials. When I asked what the J stood for in the in the name of John J. Jones, it was explained to me that it was part of his entitles. Most of the students wanted to get an education because they thought it would enable them to earn more money as school teachers. Notwithstanding what I have said about them in these respects, I have never seen a more earnest and willing company of young men and women than these students were. They were all willing to learn the right thing as soon as it was shown them what was right. I was determined to start them off on a solid and thorough foundation so far as their books were concerned. I soon learned that most of them had the merest smattering of the high sounding things that they had studied. While they could locate the desert of Sahara or the capital of China on an artificial globe, I found out that the girls could not locate the proper places for knives and forks on an actual dinner table, or the places on which the bread and meat should be set. I had to summon a good deal of courage to take a student who had been studying cube root and banking and discount to explain to him that the wisest thing for him to do was to thoroughly master the multiplication tables. Greetings, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast. How are you this evening? The number of pupils increased each week until by the end of the first month, there were nearly 50. Many of them, however, said that as they could remain only for 2 or 3 months, they wanted to enter a high class and get a diploma the first year if possible. At the end of the first 6 weeks, a new and rare face entered the school as a co teacher. This was Miss Olivia Davidson, who later became my wife. Miss Davidson was born in Ohio and received her preparatory education in the public schools of that state. When little more than a girl, she heard of the need of teachers in the South. She went to the state of Mississippi and began teaching there. Later, she taught in the city of Memphis. While teaching in Mississippi, one of her students became ill with smallpox. Everyone in the community was so frightened that no one would nurse the boy. Miss Davison closed her school and remained by the bedside of the boy night and day until he recovered. While she was at her Ohio home on vacation, the worst epidemic of yellow fever broke out in Memphis, Tennessee. That perhaps wasn't has ever occurred in the South. When she heard of this, at once she telegraphed the mayor of Memphis offering her services as a yellow fever nurse, although she had never had the disease. Greetings, forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Miss Davidson's experience in the South showed her that the people needed something more than mere book learning. She heard of the Hampton system of education and decided that this was what she wanted to do in order to prepare herself to work in the South. The attention of Miss Mary Hemingway of Boston to rare ability, was attracted to her rare ability. Though Miss Hemingway's kindness and generosity, Miss Davidson, after graduating at Hampton, received an opportunity to complete a 2 years course of training at the Massachusetts State's Normal School of Framingham. Before she went to Framingham, one suggested that Miss Davison, that since she was so very light in color, she might find it more comfortable not to be known as a colored woman in this school in Massachusetts. She at once replied that under no circumstances and for no considerations would she consent to any device in any regard in her to her racial identity. Soon after her graduation from Framingham Institute, Miss Davidson came to Tuskegee, bringing to the school many valuable and fresh ideas as to the best methods of teaching, as well as the rare moral character and life of unselfishness that I think has seldom been equaled. No single individual did more toward laying the foundations of the Tuskegee Institute so as to ensure the successful work that has than that has been done there than that has been done there than Olivia A. Davidson. So no successful work, no one else worked as hard as she did. Miss Davidson and I began consulting as to the future of the school from the first. The students were making progress in learning books and in developing their minds, but it became apparent at once that if we were to make any permanent impression upon those who had come to us for training, we must do something besides teach them mere books. The students had come from homes where they had no opportunities for lessons which would teach them how to care for their bodies. With few exceptions, the homes in Tuskegee in which the students boarded were but little improvement upon those which they had come from those which they had come from. We wanted to teach the students how to bathe, how to care for their teeth and clothing. We wanted to teach them what to eat and how to eat it properly, and how to care for their rooms. Aside from this, we wanted to give them such a practical knowledge of some one industry, together with the spirit of industry, thrift, and economy, that they would be sure of knowing how to make a living after they had left us. We wanted to teach them to study actual things instead of mere books alone. We found that the most of our students came from the country districts where agriculture in some form or other was in the main dependence of the people. We learned that about 85% of the colored people in the Gulf states depended upon agriculture for their living. Since this was true, we wanted to be careful not to educate our students out of sympathy with agricultural life, so that they could be attracted from the country to the cities and yield to the temptation of trying to live by their wits. We wanted to give them such an education as would fit a large proportion of them to be teachers, and at the same time cause them to return to the plantation districts and show the people there how to put new energy and new ideas into farming, as well as into the intellectual and moral and religious life of the people. All of these ideas and needs crowded themselves upon us with a seriousness that seemed well nigh overwhelming. What were we to do? We had only a little old shanty and the abandoned church which the good colored people of the town of Tuskegee had kindly loaned us for the accommodation of classes. The number of students was increasing daily. The more we saw of them and the more we traveled through the country districts, the more we saw that our efforts were reaching to only a partial degree the actual needs of the people whom we wanted to lift up through the medium of the students whom we should educate and send out as leaders. The more we talked with the students who were then coming to us from several parts of the state, the more we found that the chief ambition among a large proportion of them was to get an education so that they would not have to work any longer with their hands. This is illustrated by a story told of an old colored man in Alabama who, one hot day in July, while he was at work in the cotton field, suddenly stopped, looking toward the skies and said, "O Lord, the cotton am so grassy, the work am so hard, and the sun am so hot, that I believe this darky am called to preach." About 3 months after the opening of the school, and at the time when we were in the greatest anxiety about our work, there came into the market for sale an old and abandoned plantation, which was situated about a mile from the town of Tuskegee. The mansion house, or big house as it would have been called, which had been occupied by the owners during slavery, had been burned. After making a careful examination of this place, it seemed to be just the location we wanted in order to make our work effective and permanent. But how were we to get it? The price asked for it was very little, only $500, but we had no money and we were strangers in the town and had no credit. The owner of the land agreed to let us occupy the place if we could make a payment of $250 down, with the understanding that the remaining $250 must be paid within a year. Although $500 was cheap for the land, it was a large sum when we did not have any part of it. In the midst of the difficulty, I summoned a great deal of courage and wrote to my friend General J. F. B. Marshall, the treasurer at the Hampton Institute, putting the situation before him and beseeching him to lend me $250 on my own personal responsibility. Within a few days, a reply came to the effect that he had no authority to lend me money belonging to the Hampton Institute, but that he would gladly lend me the amount needed from his own personal funds. I confess that the securing of this money in this way was a great surprise to me, as well as a source of gratification. Up to that time, I had never had in my possession so much money as $100 at a time, and the loan which I had asked General Marshall for seemed tremendously large to me. The fact of my being responsible for the repaying of such a large amount of money weighed very heavily upon me. I lost no time in getting ready to move the school onto the new farm. At, at the time we occupied the place, there were standing upon it a cabin formerly used as the dining room, and an old kitchen, a stable, and an old hen house. Within a few weeks, we had all these structures in use. The stable was presently repaired and used as a recitation room, and very presently the hen house was utilized for the same purpose. I recall that one morning when I told an old colored man who lived near and who sometimes helped me that our school had grown so large that it would be necessary for us to use the hen house for school purposes, and that I wanted him to help me give it a thorough cleaning out the next day, he replied in the most earnest manner, "What you mean, boss? You surely ain't gonna clean out the hen house in the daytime." Nearly all the work of getting the new location ready for the school purposes was done by the students after school was over in the afternoon. As soon as we got the cabins in condition to be used, I determined to clear up some land so that we could plant a crop. When I explained my plan to the young men, I noticed that they did not seem to take to it very kindly. It was hard for them to see the connection between clearing the land and an education. Besides, many of them had been school teachers and they questioned whether or not clearing land would be in keeping with their dignity. In order to relieve them from any embarrassment, each afternoon after school, I took my axe and led the way to the woods. When they saw that I was not afraid or ashamed to work, they began to assist with more enthusiasm. We kept at the work each afternoon until we had cleared about 20 acres and had planted a crop. In the meantime, Miss Davidson was devising plans to repay the loan. Her first effort was made by holding festivals or suppers. She made a personal canvass among the white and colored families in the town of Tuskegee and got them to agree to give something like a cake, a chicken, bread, or pies that could be sold at the festival. Of course, the colored people were glad to give anything that they could spare, but I want to add that Miss Davison did not apply to a single white family, so far as I remember, that failed to donate something. And in many ways, the white families showed their interest in the school. Several of these festivals were held, and a quite little sum of money was raised. A canvass was also made among the people of both races for direct gifts of money, and most of those applied to gave small sums. It was often pathetic to note the gifts of the older colored people, most of whom had spent their lives in slavery. Sometimes they could give 5 cents, sometimes 25 cents. Sometimes the contribution was a quilt or a quantity of sugar cane. I recall one old woman who was about 75 years of age who came to see me when we were raising money to pay for the farm. She hobbled into the room where I was, leaning on a cane. She was clad in rags, but they were clean. She said, "Mr. Washington, God knows I spent the best days of my life in slavery. God knows I's ignorant and po, but," she added, "I knows that you and Miss Davison is trying to do something. I knows you is trying to make better men and better women for the colored race. I ain't got no money, but what's I want you to take these 6 eggs, what's I've been saving up, and I want you to put these 6 eggs into the education of these boys and gals." Since the work at Tuskegee started, it has been my privilege to receive many gifts for the benefit of the institution, but never any, I think, that touched me so deeply as that one. So as you can see, he put a lot of hard work into showing the students that there was dignity in hard work, because many of them thought that education was an escape from hard work and from manual labor. That was the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 is Anxious Days and Sleepless Nights. The coming of Christmas, that first year of our residence in Alabama, gave us an opportunity to get a farther insight into the real life of the people. The first thing that reminded us that Christmas had arrived was the 4-day visits of scores of children rapping at our doors asking for Christmas gifts. Christmas gifts between the hours of 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning. I presume that we must have had around half a hundred such calls. This custom prevails throughout this portion of the South today. During the days of slavery, it was a custom quite generally observed throughout all the southern states to give the colored people a week of holiday at Christmas, or to allow the holiday to continue as long as the Yule log lasted. The male members of the race, and often the female members, were expected to get drunk. We found that for a whole week, the colored people in and around Tuskegee dropped work the day before Christmas, and that it was difficult to get anyone to perform any service from the time they stopped work until after the new year. Persons who at other times did not use strong drink thought it quite proper to indulge in it rather freely during the Christmas week. There was a widespread hilarity and the use of guns, pistols, and gunpowder generally. The sacredness of the season seemed to have been almost wholly lost of sight. During this first Christmas vacation, I went some distance to the town to visit the people on one of the large plantations. In their poverty and ignorance, it was pathetic to see their attempts to get joy out of the season that in most parts of the country is so sacred and so dear to the heart. In one cabin, I noticed that all five of the children had to remind them of the coming Christ was a single bunch of firecrackers which had been divided among them. In another cabin, where there were at least a half dozen persons, they had only 10 cents worth of ginger cakes, which had been brought in the store the day before. In another family, they had a few pieces of sugar cane. In still another cabin, I found nothing but a jug of cheap, mean whiskey, which the husband and wife were making free use of, notwithstanding the fact that the husband was one of the local ministers. In a few instances, I found that the people had gotten some of the bright colored cards. One moment, I'm having some technical difficulties. In a few instances, I found that the people had gotten a hold of some bright colored cards that had been designed for advertising purposes and were making the most of those. In other homes, some member of the family had brought a new pistol. In the majority of these cases, there was nothing to be seen in the cabin to remind one of the coming Savior, except that the people had ceased work in the fields and they were lounging about in their homes. At night, during Christmas week, they usually had what they called a frolic in some cabin on the plantation. This meant a kind of rough dance where there was likely to be a good deal of whiskey used and where there might be some shooting or cutting with razors. While I was making this Christmas visit, I met an old colored man who was one of the numerous local preachers who tried to convince me from the experience Adam had in the Garden of Eden that God had cursed all labor and that therefore it was a sin for any man to work. For that reason, this man sought to do as little work as possible. He seemed at that time to be supremely happy because he was living, as he expressed it, through one week that was free from sin. In the school, we made a special effort to teach our students the meaning of Christmas and to give them lessons in its proper observance. In this, we have been successful to a degree that makes me feel safe in saying that the season now has a new meaning, not only through all that immediate region, but in a measure wherever our graduates have gone. At the present time, one of the most satisfactory features of Christmas and Thanksgiving seasons at Tuskegee is the unselfish and beautiful way in which our graduates and students spend their time in administering to the comfort and happiness of others, especially the unfortunate. Not long ago, some of our young men spent the holiday rebuilding a cabin for a helpless colored woman who was about 75 years old. At another time, I remember that I made it known in chapel one night that a very poor student was suffering from cold because he needed a coat. The next morning, 2 coats were sent to my office for him. Greetings, Bawana Hagziki and Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. Bawana Hagziki says, this is a blueprint for Black entrepreneurs. Booker T. Washington was straight bootstrapping at times, but the community was backing the brother, even with the eggs. I have referred to the disposition on the part of the white people in the town of Tuskegee and vicinity to help the school. From the first, I resolved to make the school a real part of the community in which it was located. I was determined that no one should have that feeling that it was a foreign institution dropped down in the midst of the people for which they had no responsibility and in which they had no interest. I noticed the very fact that they had been asked to contribute toward the purchase of the land made them begin to feel as if it was going to be their school to a large degree. I noted just in proportion as we made the white people feel that the institution was a part of the life of the community, and that while we wanted to make friends in Boston, for example, we also wanted to make white friends in Tuskegee, and that we wanted to make the school a real service to all the people. Their attitude toward the school became favorable. Perhaps I might add right here that I hope to demonstrate later that, so far as I know, the Tuskegee School at the present time has no warmer and more enthusiastic friends anywhere than it has among the white citizens of Tuskegee and throughout the state of Alabama and the entire South. From the first, that the South to I have advised our people in the South to make friends in every straightforward, manly way with their next door neighbor, whether he be a black man or a white man. I have also advised them, where no principle is at stake, to consult the interest of their local communities and to advise with their friends in regard to their voting. For several months, the work of securing the money with which to pay for the farm went on without ceasing. At the end of 3 months, enough was secured to repay the loan of $250 to General Marshall. And within 2 months more, we had secured the entire $500 and had received a deed of 100 acres of land. This gave us a great deal of satisfaction. It was not only a source of satisfaction to secure a permanent location for the school, but it was equally satisfactory to know that the greater part of the money with which it was paid for had been gotten from white and colored people in the town of Tuskegee. The most of this money was obtained by holding festivals and concerts and from small individual donations. Our next effort was in the direction of increasing the cultivation of the land so as to secure some return from it, and at the same time give the students training in agriculture. All the industries at Tuskegee have been started in natural and logical order, growing out of the needs of a community settlement. We began with farming because we wanted something to eat. Many of the students were also able to remain in school but a few weeks at a time because they had so little money with which to pay their board. Thus, another object which made it desirable to get an industrial system started was in order to make it available as a means of help the students to earn enough money so that they might be able to remain in school during the 9 months session of the school year. The first animal that the school came into possession of was an old blind horse given us by one of the white citizens of Tuskegee. Perhaps I may add here that at the present time the school owns over 200 horses, colts, mules, cows, calves, oxen, and about 700 hogs and pigs, as well as a large number of sheep and goats. The school was constantly growing in numbers, so much so that after we got the farm paid for, the cultivation of the land begun, and the old cabins which we had found on the place somewhat repaired, we turned our attention toward providing a large, substantial building. After having given a good deal of thought to the subject, we finally had the plans drawn for a building that was estimated to cost about $6,000. This seemed to us to be a tremendous sum, but we knew that the school must go backward or forward, and that our work would mean little unless we could get a hold of the students in their home life. One incident, which occurred about this time, gave me a great deal of satisfaction as well as surprise. When it became known in the town that we were discussing the plans for a new large building, a southern white man who was operating a sawmill not far from Tuskegee came to me and said that he would gladly put all the lumber necessary to erect the building on the grounds with no other guarantee for payment than my word that it would be paid for when we secured some money. I told the man frankly that at the time we did not have in our hands $1 of the money needed. Notwithstanding this, he insisted on being allowed to put the lumber on the grounds. After we had secured some portion of the money, we permitted him to do this. Miss Davidson again began the work of securing in various ways small contributions for the new building from the white and colored people in and near Tuskegee. I think I never saw a community of people so happy over anything as the colored people over the prospect of this new building. One day, when we were holding a meeting to secure the funds for its erection, an old antebellum colored man came a distance of 12 miles and brought in his ox cart, a large hog. When the meeting was in progress, he rose in the midst of the company and said that he had no money which he could give, but that he had raised two fine hogs and that he had brought one of them as a contribution toward the expenses of the building. He closed his announcement by saying, any nigger that's got any love for his race or any respect for himself will bring a hog to the next meeting. Quite a number of men in the community also volunteered to give several days' work each toward the erection of the building. After we had secured all the help that we could in Tuskegee, Miss Davidson decided to go north for the purpose of securing additional funds. For weeks, she visited individuals and spoke in churches and before Sunday schools and other organizations. She found this work quite trying and often embarrassing. The school was not known, but she was not long in winning her way into the confidence of the best people in the North. The first gift from any Northern person was received from a New York lady whom Miss Davidson met on the boat that was bringing her north. They fell into a conversation, and the Northern lady became so much interested in the effort being made at Tuskegee that before she parted with Miss Davidson, she handed a check for $50. For some time before our marriage and also after it, Miss Davidson kept up the work of securing money in the North and in the South by interesting people and by personal visits and through correspondence. At the same time, she kept in close touch with the work at Tuskegee. As lady principal and classroom teacher, in addition to this, she worked among the older people in and near Tuskegee and taught Sunday school class in the town. She was never very strong, but never seemed happy unless she was giving all of her strength to the cause which she loved. Often at night, after spending the day in going from door to door trying to interest people in the work at Tuskegee, she would be so exhausted that she could not undress herself. A lady upon whom she called in Boston afterward told me that one time when Miss Davison called to see her and sent up her card, the lady was detained a little before she could see Miss Davidson. And when she entered the parlor, she found Miss Davidson so exhausted that she had fallen asleep. While putting up our first building, which was named Porter Hall after Mr. A. H. Porter of Brooklyn, New York, who gave me a generous sum towards its erection, the need for money became acute. I had given one of our creditors a promise that upon a certain day he should be paid $400. On the morning of that day, we did not have a dollar. The mail arrived at the school at 10 o'clock, and in this mail was a check sent by Miss Davidson for exactly $400. I could relate many instances of almost the same character. This $400 was given by two ladies in Boston. 2 years later, when the work at Tuskegee had grown considerably, and when we were in the midst of a season when we were so much in need of money that the future looked doubtful and gloomy, the same two Boston ladies sent us $6,000. Words cannot describe our surprise and encouragement that the gifts brought us. Perhaps I might add here that for 14 years, these same friends sent us $6,000 each year. As soon as the plans were drawn for the new building, students began digging out the earth where the foundation was to be laid, working after their regular classes were over. They had not fully outgrown the idea that it was hardly proper for them to use their hands since they had come there, as one of them expressed it, to be educated and not to work. Gradually, though, I noted this with satisfaction that a sentiment in favor of work was gaining ground. After a few weeks of hard work, the foundations were ready and a day was appointed for the laying of the cornerstone. When it is considered that the laying of this cornerstone took place in the heart of the South in the Black Belt, in the center of that part of our country that was most devoted to slavery, that at that time slavery had been abolished only about 16 years, that only 16 years before that no Negro could be taught from books without the teacher receiving the condemnation of the law or of public sentiment. When all this is considered, the scene witnessed that day at Tuskegee was a remarkable one. I believe there are few places in the world where it could have taken place. The principal address was delivered by the Honorable Waddy Thompson, the Superintendent of Education for the county. About the cornerstone were gathered the teachers, the students, their parents and friends, the county officials who were white, and all the leading white men in that vicinity, together with many of the Black men and women whom these same white people, but a few years before, had held a title as property. The members of both races were anxious to receive the privilege of placing under the cornerstone some memento. Before the building was completed, we passed through some very trying seasons. More than once, our hearts were made to bleed, as it were, because bills were falling due that we did not have the money to meet. Perhaps no one who has not gone through the experience month after month of trying to erect buildings and provide equipment for a school when no one knew where the money was going to come from can properly appreciate the difficulties under which we labored. During the first years at Tuskegee, I recall that night after night, I would roll and toss on my bed without sleep because of the anxiety and uncertainty which we were in regarding money. I knew that in a large degree, we were trying an experiment, that of testing whether or not it was possible for Negroes to build up and control the affairs of a large educational institution. I knew that if we failed, it would injure the whole race. I knew that the presumption was against us. I knew that in the case of white people beginning such an enterprise, it would be taken for granted that they were going to succeed. But in our case, I felt that the people would be surprised if we succeeded. All this made a burden which pressed down on us. Sometimes it seemed at a rate of 1,000 pounds per square inch. In all our difficulties and anxieties, however, I never went to a white or a black person in the town of Tuskegee for any assistance that was in their power to render, without being helped according to their means. More than a dozen times, when bills figuring up into the hundreds of dollars were falling due, I applied to the white men of Tuskegee for small loans. After borrowing small amounts from as many as half a dozen persons to meet our obligations. One thing I was determined to do from the first, and that was to keep the credit of the school high. And this, I think I can say without boasting, we have done all through these years. I shall always remember a bit of advice given me by Mr. George W. Campbell, the white man whom I have referred to as the one who induced General Armstrong to send me to Tuskegee. Soon after I entered upon the work, Mr. Campbell said to me in his fatherly way, Washington, always remember that credit is capital. That's a lesson for today, you guys. Always remember that credit is capital. At one time, when we were in the greatest distress for money that we had ever experienced, I placed the situation frankly before General Washington. Without hesitation, he gave me his personal check for all the money in which he had saved for his own use. This was not the only time that General Armstrong helped Tuskegee in this way. I do not think I have ever made this fact public before. During the summer of 1882, at the end of the first year's work of the school, I was married to Miss Fanny N. Smith of Malden, West Virginia. We began keeping house in Tuskegee in the early fall. This made a home for our teachers, who now had been increased to 4 in number. My wife was also a graduate of the Hampton Institute. After earnest and constant work in the interest of the school, together with her housekeeping duties, my wife passed away in May of 1884. One child, Portia M. Washington, was born during our marriage. For my first wife, from the first, my wife most earnestly devoted her thoughts and time to work and was completely one with me in every interest and ambition. She passed away, however, before she had an opportunity of seeing what the school was designed to be. And that's the end of chapter 9. So, as you can see, both of the women that Booker T. Washington married inevitably supported him in his work. They were innovators. They rested in their femininity and nurtured his dreams and with their skills. They yielded to him. Booker T. Washington had every intention of showing these students the value of hard work. And I think that that's something that we need to reinstill in our students today, that hard work is the way that money works, that credit is capital, putting them in a position to use their name, that financial literacy piece that we often talk about, putting them in a position to use their name as to get the access to the capital that they need to inspire their entrepreneurial spirit. I thank each and every one of you for listening. I want to shout out Brother Bakari and Afro Native and Sister Raw and the Elders. I want to shout out Bawana Haguziki, The Forecast, KW Don 7, Anthony McPhail, the Bitter Medicine Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I want to shout out Tinkerbell 87. I want to shout out the boys and girls at Jesse's Kids and the boys and girls at the Daycare Ladies Network. I thank each and every one of you for listening. I will be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time reading chapters 11, 10, and 11. Again, I will be back tomorrow reading chapters 10 and 11, starting on page 148. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Peace. Yay.